Opportunity number one to publicly thank Sue Toten and our Office of Catholic Relief Services. She has been the energy and the, you might say, the power behind all of these workshops. So we're delighted, although she wouldn't want to use the word power, but it does take power in the very good sense. We have to sometimes retrieve these concepts that have been co-opted in a very destructive way. So thank you very much. I'm especially pleased that as we look at the way in which this particular day is structured and how to respond to disasters and the kinds of NGOs that are marshaled along the pathways of the world, I would just like to say one thing to you. Last night I was rereading parts of Rerum Novarum, and which dates back to 1891, Pope Leo XIII. And apart from our own contemporary culture, particularly in the United States, which would perhaps have amnesia, that's a term that's been used a lot lately in various forms and formats, if you will, but amnesia with regard to a concept in Catholic social teaching that predates, really, Rerum Novarum. It comes out of St. Thomas Aquinas, and I know for sure that St. Augustine would have agreed with it, but it's a concept called distributive justice. And it is outlined in Rerum Novarum, 1891. And Pope Leo goes into detail in terms of how important it is in forming civil society that the role of the state, the role of citizens within the state, need to be reflective about the importance of questions of justice, just wage, but also the ways in which the wealth that we accumulate is then more adequately re-examined in ways that we have an obligation, perhaps coming out of our tradition, to look at how that could be redistributed so that all throughout civil society and all peoples throughout the world can better take advantage of the gift of God's creation. So this was the beginning also of a concept that we use today. It was the genesis of the universal material goods of the world that are there for everyone. So the ways in which our NGOs, and particularly Catholic Relief Services, respond, it's not charity, it's not extra. It comes out of this very rich tradition of distributive justice. And I think we need to look at that more closely within the tradition and the rightfulness of that and the way in which distributive justice, even though we don't like it in our culture, is a way of establishing or reestablishing right relationships with the world. So to think in the context of right relationships with the world, the notion of justice and distributive justice that is so important in the ways in which those of us who contribute to, by way of our resources, material, personal, whatever, that it is not out of charity, it is out of a sense of justice for the ways in which we are responsible for each other. That is part of our tradition, the Catholic social teaching. So those are just my few insights that I would wish to share with you. And speaking of natural disasters, I'm going to be in and out because I have to deal with the natural disaster coming on Monday and the speakers we have coming, and perhaps we need to reschedule, that sort of thing, since they're emailing me. But at any rate, I know this will be a wonderful day. We are very grateful to have Mark and Jack here, and as well as the rest of you who are on the faculty and on staff. But these two men from Catholic Relief Services are extraordinary gifts to us this semester. And we are very honored and privileged to have you here. We pray for you and the work that you do, work that in some ways represents us throughout the world. So we are behind you, but we are also extremely grateful and privileged to be here with you and to learn from you what the rest of the world is like in terms of the needs and how do we respond more adequately. So you really are a gift to us, and I just want to underscore that so that you know how grateful we all are that you are here. And you are a blessing and a grace, a special grace. So we're grateful to CRS, and we're especially grateful to you, your presence, and the work that you do in the world. My goodness, we're not there, we can't do that, but it's so inspiring to know that there are people like you who are willing to do that. So we need to stand behind you and better understand the world in which we live. And today is one way of doing that. So I'm just really thrilled that we have this day to reflect on these very, very important issues. And again, I thank Sue for bringing this all together and all of you for being here. So thank you.
And Barbara, I want to thank you for all that you've done to support the partnership over the past 7 years. We would not be this far were it not for your tremendous support. So thank you. Barbara mentioned that we have 2 CRS staff who are spending their sabbatical and residence at Villanova. Their offices are in Core Hall, and I'd like them to stand. Mark Schnellbacher, who's the regional representative for the Middle East and Europe. And is Jack here? There you are, Jack, right in front of me. I never see in front of you. Jack Byrne is the country representative for Pakistan and recently assigned to Liberia. I'd also like to acknowledge Arlene Flaherty. Arlene Flaherty is the, Arlene, would you say? Okay, Arlene wants to wave. Arlene is the Peace and Justice Liaison between the Northeast Mid-Atlantic Office of Catholic Relief Services and Villanova University and the colleges and universities in this area. And Arlene and I have truly been partners in planning every single symposium, workshop, what else? I mean, I can't even name the kinds of programming we've done, but we've truly been partners in this. Now, let's see where we are. Just a quick introduction. Catholic Relief Services is the overseas humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic communities. It relieves suffering and provides assistance to people in need without regard to race, religion, or nationality. It works in 100 countries, reaches 130 million people, has a staff of 5,000 worldwide, and its international headquarters is in Baltimore, Maryland. In 2013, it will celebrate its 70th anniversary. In spring 2005, Father Edmund Dobbins signed a memorandum of understanding with Catholic Relief Services to build global solidarity with the poor and marginalized overseas through collaborating in education, research, advocacy, and service. Over the past 7 years, one of the centerpieces of our program has been our university symposia. And one of the symposia in 2010 on the global water crisis really was the inspiration for the project that Jordan Ermilio and Seth Whidden were involved in last year in Haiti. But the inspiration for this workshop goes back even a year before that. In 2009, CRS invited faculty from Villanova to visit their programming in Haiti. And I sent out a notice to faculty, and over 20 applied to go. And then there was the earthquake in January of 2010. So January 2010, all things had to be canceled. The faculty who applied for the trip and others throughout the university emailed, faculty from many departments across the university emailed wanting to know what they could do, how they might contribute to the relief and recovery work that was going on in Haiti. CRS's response to them at the time was that the situation on the ground was much too chaotic and too dangerous, and that the agency was working with multiple partners, including governments, churches, NGOs, and others, to develop a coordinated effort, and one that would enlist the capacity of Haitians themselves to build back better. Meanwhile, we were planning this conference, this symposium on the global water crisis, which brought engineers and Kim Connolly from the College of Nursing into conversation with CRS staff, particularly as water engineers. And in planning for the conference, that conversation continued about how can we be part of this effort to relieve the suffering in Haiti and to rebuild Haiti. And finally, after a whole year of conversation and planning, this project, principally between the College of Engineering and also Seth Whidden in French and Francophone Studies, developed. And so last spring, Jordan and Seth and Dan Kane, an alum from the College of Engineering, and two graduates of Villanova went to Haiti and gave a workshop for Haitian engineers on water and sanitation. And they're going to report on their learning over the years and also the best practices. So we're actually going to be starting a little early, so I hope we're okay with that. I'm going to keep the program moving. So we'll be beginning on time and ending on time. But the purpose of the first session is to help us understand better what is the nature of disasters. And our presenters will be Frank Galgano. Let me just introduce Frank, and then also Jack Byrne. Frank Galgano is the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at Villanova. Dr. Galgano is retired from the U.S. Army in 2007 as a lieutenant colonel after 27 years of service with experience in tank and cavalry units. He served in Germany, Kentucky, Texas, Saudi Arabia, and Kansas, and most recently at the United States Military Academy, where he was an academy professor and director of the geography program. Dr. Galgano is a physical geographer with expertise in coastal geomorphology, military geography, and environmental geography. He's published 6 books, 3 physical geography study guides, and more than 20 professional articles focused on geographic and military subjects. His current research involves the study of linkages between the environment and regional stability and conflict. He earned a PhD from the University of Maryland. Jack Byrne is Catholic Relief Services country representative for Pakistan. He has over 16 years of field experience working in emergency, humanitarian, and development programs on 3 continents. Since 2009, Byrne has been based in Islamabad, Pakistan, and managed a multi-sector program with over 240 national and 9 international staff, and a total program value of almost $50 million. In 2010, he managed CRS's $35 million emergency flood response to one of Pakistan's largest natural disasters. Byrne has served as CRS Honduras country representative for 4 years and as chief of party in Azerbaijan for 3 years, and I know I mispronounced that, so you'll correct me. Okay. He also served as head of office and managed CRS's first office in Albania for 2 years. He holds an MA/MS in International Development with a subspecialty in conflict resolution from the School of International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont. He speaks Spanish, Italian, and Albanian. We'll see if he does that with us today. Okay. Frank, can I turn this over to you? Are you starting? Yeah.
So I have this thing aptly called natural disasters. So I'm Frank, and Sue, I have 10 minutes? Where'd she go? Oh, it's okay. I'll go for about 10 minutes and she'll stop. So Sue asked me to talk about this, and as sort of a physical geographer, sort of a natural scientist, I thought I'd talk about the natural disasters, and so how do we think about them, okay? So there's a number of ways of doing this. So we can think about them as far as type, which would include their spatiality, and we can think of them temporally. There are patterns to natural disasters. For example, apparently we're going to experience one on Monday and Tuesday. And these happen, we live on the East Coast, and our hurricane season, really is a September, October event, okay? But we also have nor'easters, and those are winter events, and everybody gets excited about hurricanes, for example. And, we really, here on the East Coast, we get maybe one making landfall really every other year. It's a little bit weird. We have one last year, one this year. But nor'easters, we tend not to think about quite so much. They cause as much damage in many cases. We get about 17 of them a year. Okay, and those are usually from about mid-December until about early March. We see those. Okay, so that's a good example of thinking of them spatially and temporally. Or we could think of them in terms of their magnitude, in sort of their area, a death toll, damage in dollars. So there's a number of ways of thinking about disasters. And here's why I think this is important. Okay, these are two ICONOS images. They are 4-meter satellite images. And of course, if you don't recognize that, that's the Superdome in Louisiana, in New Orleans. This is, of course, before Hurricane Katrina, and this is after Hurricane Katrina. Now, the nice thing about remotely sensed images, water absorbs 2/3 of the incoming electromagnetic energy, or basically absorbs red and green light and reflects blue light. So things that are wet usually tend to appear darker, so we can kind of see everything's flooded here, okay? So thinking about Hurricane Katrina as a disaster, and as sort of a coastal scientist who's concerned about storm climatology, Hurricane Katrina, despite all of the rhetoric and all of the drum beating in the news, was not a remarkable event in terms of a geophysical event, a storm. Doesn't even make the top 15 for the last century. Okay, but what makes Hurricane Katrina a big event is where it happens. Okay, so this idea of the magnitude of the storm versus the magnitude of the damage. So a good way to think of a hurricane in the United States: every hurricane that makes landfall costs us about $1 billion, easily. This one that will make landfall Monday or Tuesday, in the end, will run us about $1 billion in damage and everything else, and lost revenues and all that. Hurricane Katrina, it depends on what you read, $80 billion to $215 billion worth of damage. And we can't even begin to sort of account for people who've lost their homes possibly forever. So this is one of the problems when we deal with natural disasters. This is an example of a very fast onset event that, frankly, reached all over the globe. I mean, we experienced the effects of this Indian Ocean tsunami here on the East Coast. About 30 hours afterwards, we got sort of our waves got about a foot bigger. I mean, so it didn't affect us any. But again, this is from Time Magazine. The death tolls are on there. So this is one that tends to be thought of in its aerial extent and also in its death toll. This is another way to think about disasters. Okay, I made this map a long time ago. Back in about 2005, I made this map. This is something that is a very slow onset. Okay, it doesn't happen very quickly. These, in terms of its effects on people, meaning the people who it's not happening to, it has a tendency to tire them out. You sort of get donor fatigue or news consumer fatigue. This, of course, is HIV, and it's kind of interesting stuff. You see places with no data, some places lose data. Well, really the issue is right here. And in terms of a disaster, it's as big a disaster as anything else. This really means that 1 in 4 people are affected or dying from some form of HIV. Okay, so it's a slow onset event. So when we think about categorizing things, we can do it in a number of ways. This is the way I did it for this talk. We can think of them atmospheric or meteorological, okay, geological events, hydrological, extraterrestrial, biological, or anthropogenic. And there's a lot of overlap between these two. So, you could read the literature, for example, is a drought really a meteorological event or a hydrological event? Well, weather people will write about a drought in their area of expertise, and stream geomorphologists and hydrologists will write about them in their journals. So there's a lot of crossover between each of these. So trying to capture what they are. Meteorological events, you can see, and these are in no particular order. we tend to think of tropical storms, and these are from tropical storms, hurricanes, cyclones, depending on however we want to define them. Nor'easters, these are extratropical cyclones. That's a nor'easter, meaning it's above the tropics. It is a cyclone like a hurricane. It's just not as deep a depression. The pressure gradient is not quite as strong. Thunderstorms, as we all know, can bring vast amounts of rain, heavy winds, and everything else. These tend to be very short onset events. Blizzards, we see. Ice storms are problematical. Last Halloween, we had a short but very brief ice storm / blizzard, and apparently it had never snowed before in southeastern Pennsylvania, and everybody lost their minds. I was trying to drive my daughter to 30th Street Station that morning. It was incredible. Of course, tornadoes, those of us who have lived in the Midwest for any period of time can understand what they do. Hailstorms in terms of crop destruction and everything else. I was stationed quite often in the Midwest. It was always great to have a hailstorm because then on the call, I don't know how many of you live in the Midwest, but all the car dealerships have hail sales, right? Because they have the cars out there. They all get beat up and then they're all on sale, and it's great. So you can get this car that looks like somebody beat it with a hammer. It's kind of neat. But of course, there's lots of crop damage as well. Windstorms, cold waves, heat waves, we see all of those. Geologic events, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis. Tsunamis is usually the result of one of these two. They are not separate events, okay? It's not a tsunami, but they're usually the result of some seismic or volcanism activity. Mass movements include a broad scope of things: landslides, mudslides, slumping, all of those things where the land moves usually rather quickly. And then there's subsidence. This is a slow onset event. Sometimes these are problematical, sometimes not. If you live on the Gulf Coast, subsidence is a long onset disaster for you. The Mississippi River Delta is slowly pushing the coastal plain downward. We're also pulling out gas and oil and water, which is speeding that up. So if you live in Louisiana, you're losing several hundred acres of marsh a day. Okay, so that is sort of an ecological disaster along with that. And sinkholes, you hear about these every once in a while in Florida. Certainly a big problem in different parts of the world. Hydrologic events, flood, drought, wildfire. And again, wildfire seems odd there, but we think of that as generally drying conditions that we cause that. Extraterrestrial events, meteorites, asteroids. The aliens are not on there because you can't see them, but these are not anything that we've had recently, but there are great historical and geologic examples of rather large extraterrestrial events on Earth. Some of these can be civilization-changing events if they ever happen again. So we can see those. Then there's biological. We could think of disease and epidemic. Epidemic being a very rapid, very localized onset of a disease. And of course, pandemics being a global onset of a disease. Overpopulation we'll put here as well as famine. And then there's a whole host of anthropogenic ones, and this is certainly not an exclusive list. Pollution, environmental damage, industrial accidents, industrial pollution, mining disasters, nuclear disasters, structural disasters. The collapse of a bridge in Minneapolis a couple of years ago is a good example of that. Transportation disasters and weapons of mass destruction. And I guess I called it war here, a general idea of conflict, okay, which is an anthropogenically started disaster. So what I did was I took our list of geologic events, and so I tried to give the idea of their spatial characteristics from very small areas to very large areas, and very slow events to very fast manifesting events. So, for example, a mass movement. If you're sitting along a bluff along the Mississippi River, well, over a period of a decade, your bluff may have been destabilized. Now, either you have a heavy rain that destabilizes the slope further, but within moments, your house is 20 feet above the river, and then it's in the river, okay? So that's what we mean by a fast-moving event. These are generally very localized. You don't see those. Subsidence occurs very slowly. It's a slow sinking of the land. And again, it happens slow over very small spatial scales. The ones we tend to think about are these tsunamis, earthquakes, and everything else. These are usually more rapid events, and they are over much broader areas. Now the key here is as you're thinking about planning for these things, they each engender different sorts of planning criteria as we think about them as natural events. So the amount of material you're going to have to bring in, the length of time you're going to have to be in the area. My first experience with an event was 1992, Hurricane Andrew. There I was in South Florida with all my great American pals. We brought them food. They didn't like our food. It was in bags and stuff, and they said, "Well, this food's terrible." So, "Well, this is the food that we eat. We don't have the good stuff in the tent over here." It's kind of neat. The showers weren't warm enough. It was an exciting trip down to Florida in 1992. In fact, we gave them our showers. We didn't have them, and we weren't allowed to use them, but they were not warm enough. That was fun. In any event, so the idea is for planning for these events, there are so they also have times of the year now. Tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes happen in specific places. Okay, they don't happen everywhere. If we think about meteorological events, they happen usually at specific times of the year and in specific places. So there are some planning paradigms that we can think about. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jack, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Frank. Morning. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Let me just get this. I made a presentation yesterday at Frank's class, or a lecture, on this topic, which I won't go through. It's just a couple of pieces that are relevant to the discussion. What I've been asked to talk about, Frank gave you the big picture, the geographical picture of what disasters look like, what kinds there are. What I'm talking about a little bit, just touching on, is the difference between natural and man-made disasters and how CRS responds to those. So those two examples of natural and man-made I will show you now, both in Pakistan, the floods of 2010 and the complex or man-made disaster that happened just about 8 months before that in the valley of Swat in Pakistan, when insurgents and the military fought. The military fighting to get them out of the Swat Valley. They were moving close to Islamabad, and so people panicked, and so the Pakistan army came in. And so, of course, that resulted in many displaced people. But let me just go on to give a face to this disaster in Pakistan. It happened not far after Haiti, but certainly did not get the play that Haiti did in the media.
In late July, 3 days of torrential rain hit Pakistan, causing some of the worst flooding the country has ever seen. The monsoon storms triggered ferocious floods that left 1,800 people dead and more than 18 million others in need of humanitarian aid. The floods began in the north, where the banks of the Indus River overflowed, unleashing a torrent of water that raced through the heart of the country, destroying roads, fields, and entire communities. As the tsunami of water moved south, dams broke, bridges washed away. Rivers in Punjab and Sindh swelled up to 20 times their normal size. People ran for their lives, others barely held on. By the time the waters began to recede, 1/5 of the country was underwater, and 1 in 10 Pakistanis had been affected. Millions had lost everything.
I have been working in the development and humanitarian agency work for so long, and I've never seen such destruction.
The government, the United Nations, and humanitarian organizations raced to the worst-hit areas. They erected tents and dug latrines. They distributed food and drinking water.
And that's why I cut it off. It's about a 10-minute film that CRS produced 1 year after the event to kind of keep attention focused on the event and to show other stakeholders in Pakistan and donors in the United States and across Europe what we had done with their money. So that's what that film is about. But it helps you get an idea of how bad it was, how very little coverage there was of it when you think about it. It kind of was in the news for a few days. BBC did a little bit on it, then it kind of disappeared. Standing water, which is really how it ended up, is really not all that compelling. And a low death rate is also not that compelling to a planet fatigued by disasters over time. When a natural disaster happens, it's very easy for CRS to kick into place. CRS is known for its response to emergencies throughout the world in 102 countries. It is one of our core programs. It is something we do very well and very quickly. So when this kind of a disaster happens, there is a set of standard operating procedures, rules, everything that kicks into place that people know how to do. Standardized across countries and regions to the extent possible. Staffing up, of course, donor relations, writing proposals, getting money, getting media attention. These are things that we are trained to do and that we train our national staff to do. The program in Pakistan grew to about 550 staff, all but 11 of whom were Pakistani. Our hiring practices in every country we work in reflects the demographic of the country. So we hire mostly Muslims, not Christians, not Catholics, which did, of course, cause some trouble along the way. So what we do also in natural disasters, it is an easier versus man-made way to get money from donors across the world. It is a tragedy, it is man-made, it is an earthquake, it is a hurricane, it is a flood. People generally are more responsive to that kind of a disaster. And so we know how to tap into those large donors, both institutional and private. The man-made disaster that happened just 8 months before this, and which was still going on when the flood happened, was this insurgency in the Valley of the Swat, as I mentioned. We also were involved in responding to that, but it is a completely different animal, and it brings up completely a new set of challenges and responsibilities when we get involved in something that is caused by the military, by insurgency, by civil wars. Many in Africa countries are a good example of that. So how do we respond to that and yet keep our neutrality, our impartiality to help those who need help and not be caught up in being complicit or tainting our relationship with those people that we help by seeming to be working with the military in some cases. In the case of SWAT, girls' schools were destroyed. Not only were people displaced because they did not feel safe, because there was fighting all around them, but the Taliban made sure that they would kind of ensure that when they left, if they were being kicked out, they would do what they could to destroy any hope that there would be girls' education in the future. So this is one of the areas that we took on to respond to. We are not a big UN agency. We had to be strategic in what we could do and who we could help. So we chose to help small villages outside of Mingora, where Malala is from, if you know that name, and targeted these villages that we felt were safe, that we could work in. Not me, certainly not international staff, but only Pakistani staff, and do these small interventions that would not, first of all, upset the people that we were trying to help by saying, well, we're going to give you another school. Maybe they didn't want another school. Maybe girls weren't going to go to school and they didn't want them to be in school. And by antagonizing the military, who are trying to sweep clean the insurgency, and then we're coming in right behind with our INGO American way of doing things. Is that really the right approach, right intervention? Again, as I say, the perception that INGOs are somehow complicit in this activity, if we are there helping and we are all on the ground. The use of military resources, transportation of materials, tents, food. Do we use them in an emergency? Because that's all there is and we can't get there over the roads. But the Pakistani army is offering its helicopters. Now, would we, as an American faith-based NGO or anyone else, any UN agency, say, oh yeah, okay, well, this is great, this is easy, this is much, we don't have the transportation methodology, we will go with you in a Pakistani helicopter? Well, no, that would never happen. I mean, and that was a decision made by the entire humanitarian community, and we stood together and decided that that was not one of us would break from that, because then it ruins everyone's credibility. Meanwhile, while we're arguing this point in Islamabad, at endless meetings, people are suffering and people need our help. And so what are we going to do in this complex man-made emergency? Again, as I say, CRS's choice was to go in with small interventions with an assessment prior, of course, that measured as closely as possible a level of community acceptance. Did they really want us? Were they just saying they wanted us? Were we reading the signs correctly? Were they really telling us the truth? Were they just looking for a handout? I mean, all these things that had to be considered before we could enter for our own safety, the safety of our staff, and of course, for their dignity and safety, and for our attempt to help them relocate their lives in the places of origin where they came from. It's just a brief list, a kind of natural versus man-made, and the challenges with each one. In my experience, the natural, even though it's larger, more people affected than the one in Swat, this flood, of course, it was easier, and I don't mean it was never easy, but it was easier to make choices about who to help, what to do. It was clearer. You knew what people needed. And even the government of Pakistan, which is not very friendly to the US at this point, was willing to let a lot of us come in. Thousands of INGOs and other actors and stakeholders on the ground to respond. That was not the case in SWAT. It was very controlled, very limited, no access, a lot of permissions, and we were constrained at every step. Meanwhile, these people have been displaced. They're living on the road or with families who will take them in. It goes on for months. A man-made disaster, a complex emergency, tends to go on a little longer. I mean, both sides fighting. It's still going on in Pakistan. And in that same time frame, 3 floods have happened and been responded to, 2010, 11, and 12. Mark will talk about this at greater length, but also what comes into play in both natural and man-made disasters and how we respond, not just CRS, but any of the other large INGOs like CARE or Save the Children, is how we have to manage the changing nature of the business. And it is a business. That we should be very clear that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, if you will, of helping people around the world. The business has changed since I started, and certainly maybe since Mark did, because there are actors and other stakeholders we have to work with now that we never might have had to in the past. In the case of Pakistan, it is mullahs, it is religious leaders, very conservative, and they have to sign off on what we do. It is the local government and the national government that has to give its imprimatur to working there. And that doesn't always happen. Our perception, our sense always in the past has been, they are welcoming. Thank you for coming with your help. We need you, we're so grateful. That's not the message anymore. Pakistan's message to us was, thanks, go home, we don't need you. We'll do it ourselves. We didn't go home, of course. We're not going to go home unless we're kicked out. But this was the conflict. This was the challenge. How are we going to do what it is our mandate to do in the midst of these roadblocks and hugely complicated political, socioeconomic maneuverings that go on at a level much higher than my pay grade? The changing nature of the actors that we have to work with, the number of competitors that are in the field now, that is contractors, i.e. beltway bandits, who have lots of money to respond and build roads and rebuild power grids and to come in under the guise, many times, of an INGO, but who do not have a mission and a vision that CRS does. They are not there to help the poorest of the poor, to give dignity back to people. They are there to win a contract from USAID. You can tell I might be a little prejudiced about this. I'm not very good at hiding this. But it is on the ground, when you're there, it creates a lot of tension and competition for those that have greater resources than we do. And CRS has quite a good bit of resources, $800 million a year. But to compete with the likes of a Chemonics, for example, if you've heard of them, it is in a different league. And it's not so much that they have more money, it's the fact that they are a for-profit company coming in, not a nonprofit or private voluntary organization that is there for a completely different reason, and that is there to stay through the long term, not helicoptering in and out for 6 months and doing a little of this and say, all right, you're on your own now. But CRS is there and committed to staying for as long as it takes. What Barbara said, just to conclude my comments, what Barbara said earlier in her opening remarks, that this is not charity, what we do, it is distributive justice. She was exactly right. We are trying to reestablish right relationships. We are looking at issues of social justice in everything we do. In every tent we put up, in every water system we build, in every sack of flour that we distribute. Everything that happens before those distributions is all about social justice, targeting the poorest of the poor, working where no one else has worked, and doing what we can do in the midst of this insanity that is a huge natural disaster, to make sure we stay on message, which is social justice, the poorest of the poor, and for as long as it takes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack and Mark. We'd like to open it for Q&A for maybe 10, 15 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask the two of you to simply respond to questions.
Do you assess the notion that the Pakistan government in this particular example is looking to get international NGOs out of their country as a good thing or a bad thing?
They don't necessarily want us out, but they certainly want to control our movements. They said to me at one point, I remember someone in the north of Pakistan saying, we just can't have a lot of women in blue jeans running around our country. I mean, this is their perception of who we are and what we're trying to do. So a lot of women in Nikes and blue jeans in these conservative countries, in communities, is just not going to work. Things were different before 9/11. Things were different before Osama bin Laden. And those are the two markers that I use that changed the playing field dramatically. So there may be a greater push in the years to come to slowly but surely eliminate foreigners, the term they use, and INGOs helping who many are convinced we are there as spies. An example, we used pads, tablets out in the field to do rapid assessments in the last flood. But these pads then, people look at them and say, oh my God, you're taking photos of us, this information is going straight to Barack Obama. We're trying to convince them that it's not the case. This is a tool for more rapid response. But these are the kind of challenges on the ground that we face. Yes.
I have a follow-up to that question. In addition to coming primarily from the United States, how has the fact that the CRS is grounded in a religion that may be very distinct from the communities that you're working in, how's that been a barrier and how have you overcome that?
Going in as a faith-based, a Catholic American INGO, is two strikes against us completely. But that said, we have been there for over 50 years, so we must be doing something right. What we do is work through local partners. We are not the face of these responses. We are not the face of every emergency. I'm not out there. It is the 500 staff who are 95% Muslim, which is the same demographic as the country, 95% Muslim, 5% other, which is Sikhs, Sindhis, Hindus, Catholics, or Christian. So they are the ones doing the work. It's not that we are hiding behind local organizations. Part of our mission, of course, is to build the capacity of local organizations so that we work ourselves out of a job, that we are not operational, that we are there simply for technical assistance. So this is how we operate. There were challenges, not only for us, but for every INGO, even not faith-based. CARE, Save the Children, all had challenges.
That I've been in the Middle East most of the time since 9/11, and so we have the two faces, CRS. It's American and it's Catholic. And I was much more comfortable in the Muslim world, or at least the Arab world, talking about the Catholic face than the American face. And that wasn't only because of the view of most Arabs on the street about American foreign policy in their world for 50 years, but because most Muslims take their religion very seriously. And therefore they take religion very seriously, theirs and others. And so they could it made sense to them why somebody would be doing this kind of work for religiously motivated reasons. They couldn't really figure out why people would do it for Oxfam or Save the Children. which are secular NGOs. That doesn't make much sense to them. But because of their tradition of tithing, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is tithing, it just makes sense why you would do it. So it was a much better, if I had to point to one of the two, the default for me was the Catholic face rather than the American face.
And the same held true in Pakistan and Afghanistan, where it was much easier to operate as faith-based than to say you were an American. So we didn't say much of either. We just kind of did the work and worked through our partners. And the church. The church, as small as it is in Pakistan, was, of course, our partner of preference, but they helped us implement. And they have been there much longer than we have, and they have relationships on the ground, pastoral work like that we never have had. So they were a huge assist in our work there.
2 questions, please, about USAID. 1, how widespread is your condemnation of them? You didn't admire the way they hired those contractors. But 2, doesn't Catholic Relief Services get money from the U.S. government? And if so, doesn't it come from USAID, or where does it come from? And I just want to say that I was close to what was happening in Central America in the 80s and early 90s. And by the 90s, religious people that I knew were admiring what USAID was doing. Maybe not before then, but at least then.
I should not have shared my own personal, opinion of USAID. Actually, I've worked with them for years, and they have some very good people working with them. So let me kind of step back from that. CRS gets a great deal of its money from the U.S. government. The largest percentage of? Largest single source across the world. In Africa, in Asia, in Central America, wherever we work. So certainly they are a donor that we respect, who respects us, who knows our track record, and who continues to fund us because of what we are able to produce, the accountability we can show, and the monitoring and the evaluation we can show. My particular beef in Pakistan was that their money was going to contractors. So it's contractors, the ones, that's who my prejudice is against, not so much the U.S. government. They are doing what they can in a difficult environment like Pakistan. Yes?
This may be a bigger answer than what we need here, but CRS does a lot with response to what's going on with natural disasters and man-made disasters. How much work goes towards preventive maintenance?
Exactly. No, good question. I mean, in Pakistan, where there were floods for 3 years in the same place at the same time of the year, affecting the same people, we were shaking our heads and saying, what? This is going to come again? There's this national amnesia that is going to reign again, and these people are going to be affected by it. So what we did after the first year, in 2011 and 2012, was concentrate on mitigation. Even the smallest disaster mitigation and preparedness, even the smallest, most elemental steps. Move to higher ground, establish an early warning system, get your seeds in a dry place. So we provided Ziploc bags, pretty serious Ziploc bags that are this big and quite heavy. But these small measures that small communities could take, because it's going to rain again, and indeed it did for the 3rd time in 3 years for the same people who are already on their knees after the first flood in 2010. Their resilience is limited. So if it rains again next year, we'll respond again, as we always do, but we will focus a lot more on prevention and preparedness.
Actually, the question is for Dr. Galgano.
Yes, please.
It's regarding, are we seeing any trends in terms of natural disasters? Are we just hearing more about them, or is there really an increase? And then a second question is, I'm curious about any interplay between man-made and natural disasters. Either the man-made causing later conflict because of limited resources, or destruction that might come out of conflict leading to natural disasters.
talk about your first one. And I'll talk about hurricane. I'm so as a coastal scientist dealing with storm climatology. So I think I don't think there's any more disasters than there used to be, and there certainly are no more hurricanes than there used to be. So we're a function of, like a lot of things, a 24-hour news cycle. And you know, so we have a hurricane, you know, we have this thing coming now, and I think it was talking with Kathleen, right? So what's going to happen on Monday and Tuesday? So how many times have we seen, you know, we've turned on Channel 11 News or Channel 6, and we've had Storm Center, right? And they get everybody worked up in a lather in the tri-state area, and then nothing happens, okay? You know, so my dissertation advisor's favorite comment was, every time there's a hurricane, you know, back then Dan Rather was on the news, and he would strap himself to some telephone pole on the Jersey Shore, you know, and shout into the microphone. So there's sort of an ignorance of what these things are, and then so I think certainly in our country I think we sort of amped up the volume on a lot of these things. Then there's also been, and certainly the hurricane issue, is this whole linkage between global warming, environmental change, and storms. So, you know, the Hurricane Katrina being the seminal event, we had this storm that caused lots of damage, and it was, you know, the terms that were used were monster and, you know, it was Armageddon, and it was a Category 3 hurricane. It was, as I said, from if I was just to put on my geophysical hat, it was nothing. I mean, you know, it was still, but yeah, it was a tragic event for Louisiana and New Orleans. So, you know, I think Kathleen, I gave me a call one day. It was about a year and a half ago. We had an earthquake in Chile, and then there was one off the, and you know, you get the news people. Well, these are related. No, they're not. They're separate tectonic plates. So I think they're covered more in the news now because they're events, and it appears that there are more of them happening. There are pulses in hurricanes, for example. You know, our friend Dr. Gray out at Colorado State tries to predict them every year, and you know, they just don't. They're hard to figure out. So there appear to be decadal cycles in storms, and it's got to do with large movements of the global circulation model. And so we will run into a period where there are more storms. So a good example is we had the 1962 nor'easter. Not many of us were around then, but you know, so, but it was a big storm. It geomorphically changing. It wiped out the entire East Coast. And we don't have another storm on the East Coast to speak of until 1992. Okay. So, and that's when we see this big boom in building along the East Coast. So we see these odd things. And then you get a period in 1992, there was a giant storm. 1993, there was a giant storm. And then, you know, there was a little bit more uptick in hurricane activity. So there are no more earthquakes than before. There are no more there's no more additional volcanoes than there were before. But what we do see more and more of are what I mentioned, industrial/pollution events, are things like acid rain events. And I mean, these are certainly happening more and more. And so, you know, those are problematic.
Jack, can I ask you a question? I have two questions. The first is, why is the U.S. government resorting more and more to contractors? And then the second question is, what about all those good people like us who want to help, let's say in natural disasters? What do you do with us? But go back to the first question first.
Mark, please. Yeah.
Going back to, because that was Jesse Helms actually, when he was trying to kill foreign aid entirely, almost 30 years ago. Wasn't successful. But what he was successful at, rather than reducing the amount of foreign aid which went overseas, was really cutting back on AID itself. Mm-hmm. And the staffing of AID was purposefully cut back. That was his way to sort of thinking eventually that'll strangle the whole foreign aid enterprise. And so they gave up a lot of their technical abilities, their technical expertise, which they had built up since the late 50s, was pretty much gutted. as was their sort of contract management capacities, their acquisition, and then managing those awards. And so what they had to do was figure out a way, how do we, and the amount of foreign aid didn't go down, just the capacity of this rather large bureaucracy to manage it well went down, was purposely brought down. So what they decided, one of the reactions they did to deal with this was, rather than doing $25 million grants or contracts to different organizations, often like CRS or CARE or Save the Children, they decided, we're going to let one $100 million contract because it's easier for us to manage. And this has been going on for the last 15 years or so, and one of the consequences of that has been it's created all of these, what Jack called the Beltway bandits, have come up like mushrooms after a spring rain, because there's big profit in this. And secondly, it's pushed out, or pushed to the margins in many cases, a lot of organizations like CRS, because of the nature of the contract. I mean, we have a problem with contracts. A contract is what you have with your plumber. You tell him what you want to do, he gives you a price, and you pay for what he does. We don't like that, because we don't want to be contracting to the US government, because there's just the nature of what a contractor is, that relationship. It's not our program, it's the US government's program, and we're basically doing it for them. We're much more comfortable as an organization in our identity to do to take either grants, these are the technical terms, grants or cooperative agreements, which is basically our program, which the US government agrees to provide funding to, usually not 100%. So this is really what it has resulted in, this gutted management capacity, and now it's become a self-fulfilling, there's now all of these Beltway bandits, or Jack alluded to them, these hybrid NGOs. They sort of call themselves NGOs so they can have the best of both worlds, but they actually operate like a for-profit company, and they have no constituency other than their shareholders, whereas CRS would claim its constituency to be the Catholic community, American Jewish World Service would claim the American Jewish community, World Vision would claim any in the evangelical community. So we view a constituency, which is not the case with these hybrid organizations. So this is where we sort of, how it came about, where we find ourselves now.
With Mark, the self-fulfilling prophecy of this contractor thing can't be overlooked. There's a lot of functions that are performed or have been performed by the United States government for many, many years, and they're not cost effective. Okay, they're just not, and you can't apply a business model to them. So, especially in the 1990s and afterwards, we began to try to develop business models for things that the Department of Defense did, the Department of State, USAID, the Department of Agriculture. And the point is, if you have a team of people whose job it is to sit there and prepare for droughts in the Midwest, for 10 years there's no droughts in the Midwest, and so it's like we don't need these folks. We can hire contractors who are cheaper. It's like hiring an adjunct versus a full professor, right? You don't have all the additional costs that you don't. For example, for me, you don't have my retirement costs, my lifetime medical benefits. So we can hire somebody from Brown and Root to go to Bosnia, and so we have this crazy notion that for that period of time it's cheaper. So what has happened is, and we saw it come to, at least from my perspective, with the Department of Defense, reared its ugly head in its worst form in Iraq afterwards, with these weird, unaccountable, much more expensive and unwieldy contractors that moved in. And I think my first experience with them was in Bosnia. I think we went to President Clinton, I think, backed himself into a corner with Congress. I don't want to get too technical on you. We're going to send the 1st Armored Division to Bosnia, right, to separate the sides. 1st Armored Division has 17,000 soldiers in it. President Clinton capped our president. He promised to send the whole 1st Armored Division to NATO, and then said, yeah, we're only going to send 30,000 soldiers. Well, for all of us sitting there going, well, boss, you can't do that. It takes 7 people for every 1 soldier in the field to keep them fed and, and all of that. So to make that number work, they hired Brown and Root. Brown and Root, and so instead of bringing construction engineers, they brought in Brown and Root, and they built us these weird plywood huts. They did it in a factory in Tuzla that was full of arsenic, and it was besides the point. But it was great to work with those guys, and they came and they went away, but they were accountable to nobody. So if it was another engineer or lieutenant colonel, I could grab him by his chest and say, "Hey, stupid, we're moving." But this is how you see these things start. So at the same time, we were trying to shrink our government in the 1990s. The sort of peace benefit, which really manifested itself across the whole government. We had this nutty notion that this was a business model that we could run it along, and the government. I know you listen to the debates and all this other stuff. The government does not work on a business model. It can't. There are things that are inherently inefficient that the government has to have in place to happen when we need them. And just saying, oh, we'll call SEIC or Halliburton to come and do it. It looks good it's like putting solar cane on the sunburn. It feels good for a while, but the sunburn is still there. So.
Thank you. We're going to have to put off my second question, but it's something that I'm going to raise throughout. It's time for us to take a 10-minute break. We'll resume at 10:30, and